Hello, my name is Scott Prophet. Welcome to Classics 170, Greek and Roman Mythology. For the next 6 weeks, we're going to be learning about some of my very favorite stories, the myths of the Greeks and the Romans. Who are the Greeks and the Romans, you might ask? Well, this is a really good question to be asking. It's important to see these places on a map before we even begin discussing their literature. When you think about Greece, perhaps it is best to think of the place currently occupied by the modern state of Greece. The people who lived there a few thousand years ago are the people who came up with a lot of the stories we'll be learning in this class. Perhaps you think of a place that's perfect for vacationing, a place full of beautiful lagoons and sandy beaches. This is also true. Maybe you think of really old buildings like the Parthenon in Athens here. This is true as well. Maybe you think of old works of art like this vase. Maybe you think of old men walking around philosophizing, and long roads and longer beards. Maybe you think of tough guys fighting it out for freedom, like Leonidas here in the 300. Maybe you think of Perseus fighting off monsters. This is also true. Now let's talk a bit about the Romans. When you think about Rome, perhaps it's best not just to think about the city of Rome, or even the Italian peninsula, but rather an empire that stretched in the west as far as Spain, and in the east as far as Turkey and Armenia, from the north to what is now Germany and Britain, as far south as Egypt, an impressive space for people who lived so long ago. Maybe you think about Julius Caesar and that play Shakespeare wrote about him. Maybe you think about gladiators or charioteers. Maybe you think about the Colosseum in Rome. These are all good things to think about when you think about the Romans. Both of these cultures are very old. Both of these cultures have a lot to tell us about who we are right now. Before we dive into the whole mythology thing, maybe it's best if we first talk about literature. Now, literature, as far as I'm concerned, is anything that's written down. So, what do you think of when you think of literature? Maybe you think of fiction. Maybe you think of poetry. Maybe you think of works of religious literature, like the Bible or the Quran. Maybe you think of history. Perhaps you think of philosophy. Just this afternoon I was reading a how-to manual on how to fix a sink. That was helpful to me. That's literature. Maybe you think of journalism, like newspapers. Maybe you think of social media, like Facebook or Twitter. All of these things are literature. Well, myth is an important part of this. But what is myth? The American Heritage Dictionary defines it as a traditional, typically ancient story dealing with supernatural beings, ancestors, or heroes that serves as a fundamental type in the worldview of a people, as by explaining aspects of the natural world or delineating of psychology, customs, or ideals of society. That's a mouthful. Let's break that down into smaller chunks. Maybe it's more digestible if we talk about the individual components that make a myth a myth. A myth typically then is old. It's not typically a story that was made up yesterday. It often involves ancestors, supernatural beings, gods, monsters, maybe both, or heroes. And it tells us a bit about how a group sees its world. That is, how the people who tell this myth see their world. And it explains how things came to be the way they are now, whether they're natural phenomena, such as events in weather or volcanoes, social norms, or the way people think about their world. That's what myth is. What's mythology then? Well, mythology, according to the Oxford Classical Dictionary, is a field of scholarship dealing with myth, but also a particular body of myths. And myth goes back to the Greek word mythos, which originally meant word, speech, or message. So, when we talk about myth and mythology, I want you for a minute, and perhaps for the rest of this course, to take away from yourself the idea that myth is necessarily false. This won't be helpful, especially as the myths we'll be learning get at deeper truths in the human condition. Let's talk about the authors we'll be studying in this class. First one we'll be reading is a man named Hesiod. He was born around 700 BCE in Askra, Greece. He wrote two important works for us, the Theogony and the Works and Days. And he wrote both of these in Greek. He was a shepherd, and he was not a rich man. His Theogony deals with the origin and genealogies of the ancient Greek gods, and his Works and Days is a work primarily concerned with a legal quarrel between him and his brother, but it also gets into how things got to be the way they are now. It gets into the human condition. We'll be reading the Bible. We'll be reading the Genesis, chapters 1 through 3. This was originally written in Hebrew, and it wasn't written down any time before the 600s BCE. It describes the creation in ways that are useful for comparison when we discuss Greek and Roman mythology. We'll be reading the works of a man named Ovid. His real name was Publius Ovidius Naso, and he lived between 43 BCE and 17 CE. But again, from here on in, I'll be calling him Ovid. He was Roman, and he wrote in the Latin language. His chief work, the one we'll be concerning ourselves with the most, is something called the Metamorphoses. And this is a work that concerns itself with changes, transformations from one thing to another. And it begins with the beginning of the universe and ends with the death of Caesar. It's impressive in that it takes all of Greek and Roman mythology and packs it into one work. We'll be reading Homer. He was a Greek poet who lived in the 8th century BCE. He is said to have been blind and was from the island of Chios. He didn't write poems in the way that we now think of written composition. Instead, he sang them, and his poetry is what's said to be oral literature. He composed his Iliad around 750 BCE, and his Odyssey around 725 BCE. We'll be reading both of these works. We'll be reading a bit of Proclus, who lived from 410 to 485 CE, and he was a Roman of the later part of the empire, who actually wrote in Greek. He was a philosopher who wrote a work called the Chrestomathy, a kind of handbook for writers, and it contains synopses of other epics of the ancient world. And he'll be helpful for us for kind of making the Iliad and the Odyssey fit into context. We'll be reading a bit of Statius, and he wrote about mythological subjects having to do with epic cycles surrounding the Iliad and the Odyssey. Again, great for helping us fill in the blanks between the Iliad and the Odyssey. We'll be reading a bit of Apollodorus, who wrote the Bibliotheke, a handbook on the subject of Greek myth, and he's actually one of our best sources for Jason, Perseus, and Heracles. We'll be reading Aeschylus, an Athenian playwright who wrote in Greek, and the most ancient of the Greek Athenian tragic playwrights. He's important for us because he left us 7 complete plays and 400 fragments of other works. He's considered to be the brainiest and the heaviest of the Greek tragic playwrights. We'll be reading Sophocles, an Athenian playwright who wrote in Greek. We only also have 7 of his works, even though he wrote 123. He's most famous for his works as they deal with religion and the state, and especially as these fit into the Athens of during his lifetime. The last of the Athenian playwrights we'll be reading are the works of a man by the name of Euripides, born in the 480s BCE and dying around 406 BCE. He was an Athenian, and he wrote in Greek. While he wasn't quite as critically acclaimed as either Sophocles or Aeschylus, he's important to us because his works take into account the thoughts, emotions, and other motivations of his characters. And this is important as the medium of tragedy evolved over time. We'll also be reading the works of one Publius Virgilius Maro, also known as Virgil. He wrote the Roman national epic, the Aeneid. And he's important because he takes the works of Homer and does something new with them by bringing them into a distinctly Roman context. We'll be reading the works of Titus Livius, known to us as Livy. He lived around the same time as Virgil, but lived a bit longer. He wrote in Latin, and he wrote a history called the Ab Urbe Condita, which is a history of Rome from its mythological foundations all the way to the year 9 BCE. And what he does is he takes into account myth and tries to find the truth in it. I look forward to reading all this with you as we go through this course, and it's my hope that you'll enjoy these works as much as I do. Now, let's turn to the names of the gods and who they are.